Good morning. Good morning to everyone. My name is Isaac Carter. I am part of 6 Seconds Preferred Partner. I am the moderator today for our conversation. We're going to be exploring how and what are the connections between emotional intelligence and how it connects to achieving DEI goals in higher education. So we have a dynamic set of panelists for you today. And the comment section, it will be open so that you can ask questions toward the panelists for our conversation. And I'm hoping everybody's here today and knows about our upcoming conference at the end of June. This is one of the live streams leading up to it. We'll have another one in June, and then we'll have our conference in the last week of June, 28th, 29th, 30th. And without saying any more, I would love to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and tell a little bit about who they are. Again, my name is Isaac Carter, 6 Seconds Preferred Partner. I'm the founder of the Coaching Imperative, and I'm really, really happy to be moderating this conversation today. So, panelists.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Olivet Hines. I hail from the beautiful island of Barbados in the Caribbean. I am an organizational development consultant most of my career. That's what I've been doing. Um, I'm joining this conversation today from three perspectives. One from my OD consulting experience, one as a doctoral and master's student in the US, where I've lived and resided for the past 10 years. And thirdly, as the founder of a nonprofit called the F5 Learning Lab, which is my passion for helping doctoral students succeed using the principles of EQ to help motivate and sustain that resilience as they pursue their dissertation. So I'm happy to be here and look forward to sharing with you.
Thank you, Olivet. Dr. Gonzalez, you can go next. Introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Isaac. I am Beatrice Gonzalez. I, too, am from the Caribbean. I was born in Havana, Cuba. So high five, Olivet. And we are well representing the Eastern Seaboard because I'm in Miami. So a little bit about where we're coming from today. In terms of this conversation, I hope to contribute from my perspective as a student for many, many years, but also as a faculty member, and then from having held various leadership positions in higher education in various institutions, public, private, 2-year, 4-year. And so hopefully we can talk about both the individual as well as some of the systemic approaches that might help us attach EQ to equity work. I work at Miami-Dade College, where I am campus president for Wilson Campus. It is a downtown urban campus. So hopefully you won't hear a lot of sirens or that kind of commotion, just happy noise, joyful noise from students. It's a large place, about 30,000 students every year, and about 10,000 of those students are in degree-seeking programs. And so infusing, being smart about emotions is certainly important for a very large space where we hope where different people come together every day for learning. So excited about this conversation.
Well, we are happy to have you. Wanted to start out with a question, and I want to remind people you can go into the comment section and submit questions. The question I want to start out and ask you panelists is, you gave your introduction. Could you talk about how you use EQ and equity in terms of how it informs your work around diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I'll jump in a little bit on this. I think that, for a long time now, I've been engaged in leadership, and even longer than that, learning as a student and, as I said, as a teacher. And I think both leadership and learning, if they don't fully engage equity, if not broken, they're incomplete. And so for me, they're inextricably tied together, that equity must be in leadership, equity must be in learning, or if not, they're just not good enough. So as the leader of this campus, for me, it's really important that not only do we raise that kind of awareness and provide opportunities for learning and conversation at the individual level, but how can I somehow infuse that at scale so that we really move the needle in some ways. And I'm sure Olivet, from her organizational experience, has thoughts about that. What is the tipping point where enough people are talking about something that really we can make some progress?
Beatrice, I
Thank you.
think you're coming from a place similar to myself. I would come at it from, let's take it from my student experience, going through both a master's course program in New York and then my doctoral program in the DC campus of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and really having those two experiences really inform my work, what I do now with my students. Two different experiences. One where I had, in one instance, a professor who was really engaged and invested in student learning, and the other campus where I felt so isolated that I felt as though I was on my own most of the time. So my work now in terms of using EQ, since having become certified in EQ education, is really to infuse the principles of motivation and resilience and optimism in doctoral students, more so to help stay the course when life gets in the way, and to build that resilience and that emotional muscle to say to myself, I can do this and I can get through this. And I think you talked about leadership. I am of a similar view that leadership plays a critical role, where if the tenets of EQ or any aspect of inclusivity is not driven from the top, then it is very fragmented and we do not get the results that we're aiming for. So from an organizational perspective, I totally concur that leadership is important, but I think we also need to bring that individuality in ourselves, and that's where EQ comes in for me, in terms of just getting my students to understand I can do this. And even though from a system perspective, I may think or feel as though I'm on my own, I can still get through, because that's the support system that I bring to my work.
Thank you all very much for your responses. It seems you all are aligned on the inner work we must do, the inner journey that we must be on as leaders and as people who are advocating for students. And so I want to turn our attention to students. I want to get your thoughts and ideas about, what can campus leaders and educators do to create a greater sense of belonging for students, especially those students who are often marginalized and within 2 or 4 year or graduate institutions.
I'll defer to you, Beatrice, because that's your field, and then you play in that space every day. I come from a higher, more adult perspective, but I can then build on what you share.
Well, I would say first would be to include students in these conversations, thinking about that expression, no decision for me without me. And so if we really want to walk side by side with students and understand what they're going through and support them, challenge and support, that's what we always say, then we have to hear them. They have to be at the table. And I think that's true in equity work generally, that people, for it to work, people at the margins have to be at the center. They have to be helping and driving that conversation. So I think that's number one, making sure that students are at the table, engaged in whatever we're devising to help grow these EQ skills or equity mindedness in students. I think a second thing, and it's not just for students, for me, both EQ work and equity work entail high expectations for everyone. So for me, equity doesn't mean, oh, we're going to give you extra chances or you get all this extra, or EQ means I don't get to say how I'm feeling right now or address something that I'm unhappy about. It enables you to do all those things, to have high expectations for people. And what I mean by that is I approach situations, we approach the students, staff, faculty, as if you can get this, you can do this, you can be a leader in this. This is something that you're capable of. We don't have to lower any sense of understanding, and we don't have to lower any standards for us to engage in this kind of work. So I think including the students and having very high expectations for everyone sort of drives us to our best work.
Thank you, Beatrice, and all of that. I remember myself once being told by a mentor of mine that was a Chicago school teacher that said students can't rise to low expectations. And I think is one of the key things that we have to be able to expect our students to achieve and help them believe in that.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we consider the student perspective a little bit more in belonging, I would like to ask you all, in terms of empathy. Empathy has been identified as a key driver in supporting DEI goals. So if you could speak particularly to empathy itself as one of the 8 competencies that we use in 6 seconds, but also empathy, other models also included as part of emotional intelligence work. If you can comment specifically on the use of empathy and how it can really drive to the DEI, given that the workforce that our young people or adult students are going to be looking for more people who can join the workforce, who can demonstrate EQ.
Oh, Isaac, let me jump in here to say I think empathy is so important. And I'll share this from my perspective as a student, as an international student coming into the American educational system and going to the career counselor's office to get some assistance with my resume. And I'm an adult student, I'm a professional, and I felt like I had my resume down packed and I'm good. So I walked out of that office. I would never forget the day when I walked to Union Square and sat down and cried like a baby. I took the phone and I called my friend in Barbados and we had a conversation. So as I reflected on that, I asked myself, did she say something to bring me to that state of emotion? Or was it my own inner feeling that bubbled up, something for me? What was it? So I think as I look back on it and I thought about what happened, my own sense was that I was not prepared for what she shared with me, but more so the way it was shared. And I think empathy and that understanding, as Beatrice mentioned, in terms of bringing the student into the conversation, getting to know persons in terms of where they're at, where they're coming from, and how we share that type of feedback or how we have that conversation with them is so critical to the work that we do. Being culturally nuanced in our approach to students at all levels, I would say. Um, I think that in my own change work, there is something called, we came across the term, a tempered radical. Yes, we need tempered radicals. At the same time, those tempered radicals must demonstrate, as you're saying, empathy, not only for students, but for others in the system. Other than that, we can marginalize unintentionally by our intentions and by our actions.
Thank you, Oliver.
What I would add about empathy, it's I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and that's almost like the tablecloth for the entire relationship. I mean, if you can't develop empathy with a client or another person, where can you go from there? You can't change behavior. You can't do anything because you're not understanding. You're not beside them in that walk. But I would say an important thing about empathy is that it can't stay in your head. Sometimes people have empathy and wow, oh my goodness, it doesn't help the individual if you don't communicate that somehow. So in my head, I always, it's 2 words, empathy communicated. And that communication can be in many different ways. It could be words, it could be, pat on the shoulder, it could be bringing chicken soup. It could be many ways, but it can't stay only inside of you. If you have that empathy for others, It has to go outside. You have to communicate it.
Thank you both. There were some nuggets and gems that were put out there in your responses. So temperate radicals, I think that's something that John Lewis would be happy about, Mr. Good Trouble himself. And then empathy communicated. What good is to have that empathy if people do not see it? Thank you all for sharing those comments. So as we continue this discussion, I want to highlight that there are different parts of an institution. There's faculty, there's staff, there's administration, there's boards. And I would like to get your perspective on how emotional intelligence can be used or applied within different settings, depending on your function within an institution. You can speak from a faculty perspective or a staff perspective, but I think it's important that we see how the whole campus has a role in emotional intelligence as well as advancing DEI. And I will be curious in how you all will think about those different segments of an institution. Are there any specific comments you would like to have about how EQ could better inform people in those roles?
So I think I'll take a stab at that, Isaac. Coming from a change management perspective and a change leadership perspective, I feel that leadership and you coin in some of your communication, you use educators / leaders. And I like that. I would say leaders in general, because as educators, we are all leaders, no matter which role we're playing, we are all leaders and we need to see ourselves as such. At the same time, I see equity and inclusion as needing strategic focus. Without that strategic focus and direction, where it is driven from the top and infused by leaders then at each level, I think that persons can lose the way, lose their way, I should say. Similar to how we budget, how we make a strategic plan, how we go after grants, how we look at enrollment numbers, how we look at the fall offs, and how we strive ourselves on the state or the status of the college or the institution. I think that as a practice, we need to give similar focus to DEI, because it doesn't make sense one faction of the leaders, and I use leaders very broadly, are focusing on making the learning experience better for students, and another factor is just not invested. So when we have competing interests and when we have diverse views, and by that I mean when you have issues such as tenured versus contractual, when we have persons or funding for grants and faculty who are pressured to do research or then to do research and to raise the status of the institution that will attract enrollment, we're caught in a dynamic cycle. So we need to have that focus at the top and have all persons being held accountable for their practices with the students, and to ensure that this is also how we are going to be measured and how our success will be determined. That's the way I see it.
Thank you, all of that.
I think everybody's at a different place, whether it be in equity or in their development of EQ skills. And I think as we work with people to help develop those things, it is important to know where they're at. We have to have high expectations that meet the current baseline. So how can, because if the gap is so big, it's scary to people, and it's almost like a different language. And so how can we scaffold that learning so that people aren't afraid by what you're presenting? And so I think part of it is understanding where people are at, what do they know, what do they feel, what do they think about either one of these topics, and then being able to provide resources that meet where they're at. I think you also have to be attentive to what people's own purpose and goals are. And so a board who has a fiduciary responsibility is going to be very much about, okay, how will any of this affect the bottom line, our profitability, our sustainability, what we promise to our clients, who in this case are customers. And so you have to give people the language they need to do their own work. And of course, there's tons of research about people with higher emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence do well at work. So, and have higher returns at work. So the information is there. And yet that's the kind of, and you can provide it to people like the board. That's the kind of information that faculty aren't generally as interested in, right? Because they have the value of the development of the person, the development of their field. That's primary for them, as it should be. That's their role. And so maybe that's not the information we present to the faculty, to the students. Instead, we talk about the human development piece and how there are the returns in longevity, in quality of life, when you engage in these issues. So I think whoever's working on this and helping their individuals or organizations to use empathy and to be aware of where are the people at, what do they need most right now. You know, just in time learning, you know, that's a thing. Just in time, what do I need right now to learn and to keep motivated and keep interested? I think that's true in these areas too. We as the facilitators, the trainers, have to be super aware where people are at and provide the right appropriate information that's useful to them and resonates with them.
So I think Beatrice, as you're saying, in terms of meeting people where they're at and getting the interests aligned with that type of work. When I talk about a strategic imperative, how do we make that type of goal or initiative come to life from a strategic perspective, that it is driven right down to the daily work? So that as we're talking about faculty who are invested in their research and maybe the students that they're mentoring or whatever, how they not see that as tangential to what they're doing, but very integral in terms of what they're doing and in terms of the work that they're doing. And if it means stepping back and taking some type of training to help develop that competency, then that is driven from the top as well. So I'm in agreement that at the board, at the faculty, and all staff members need to be coming at it collectively and not in isolation of each other.
Thank you for your comments. It kind of helps us segue to my next question. I wanted to know from you all, have you all witnessed or are currently involved in any projects that make connections between EQ and DEI within higher education?
Olivet, did you want to?
I would say I am, but not directly.
Okay.
Not directly. My involvement in coaching my students who come to me privately for the skills to navigate the education environment is where my involvement centers. So I'm not actually in the education system directly. However, I have worked in the career counseling office in the system as well, and I've seen some of those experiences where one of the things that I really loved was that career counseling in the institution where I worked was open to everyone, and it was what you made of it. Unfortunately, some students who I felt needed it more than others failed to take advantage of it. But it was there, and I think that is one thing which pleased me to see that it was available to all, and to the credit of the institution, when there were cuts, even though the staff was reduced, the program in itself was not touched. So that was one thing that made me happy.
Well, for me, hearkening back to my earlier comments about equity being integral to leadership and learning, and EQ as well. I would say that that's where the connection is. We're engaged at a project here at this campus that we were able to fund through a Title V grant that was very intentional. Title V grant is for minority serving institutions to help build infrastructure in those institutions. And we specifically wrote a grant that was, it's called Opening the Gateways, EQ. And it has two main focuses. One is for mathematics. So how can we infuse EQ in teaching, particularly mathematics, to help make students successful, and also in sort of one of those social emotional learning classes that they have. And then the second was in faculty development. So we created the Teaching and Learning Center, where emotional intelligence is infused in what the faculty development is that's happening, as well as in faculty learning communities. So there's an EQ and teaching, a faculty learning community for that. And it's infused through the leadership, because part of what we talked about in all of it, this is to the points you've been making about that it's okay to kind of push from behind, but you do, and things like this have to lead from the front, because it signals to people what's okay to talk about, what is a priority, what is important. And so as part of this grant, the funding helps us provide a year long, the entire academic year, development for about 70 campus managers in EQ. So it's infused directly in the instruction, particularly mathematics, and some would say math and EQ. Yes, math and EQ, math and learning. It's in the faculty development piece, and it's in the leadership piece. And that goes back to what I was talking about before, that you need both pieces. You need to resource the folks, the individuals, to learn about these ideas, so then they can affect the system. And because this is such a large campus, it's important that it was students, faculty development, and the leadership, who have lots of staff, who are making lots of budgetary decisions. And as we know, Martin Luther King, budget is a moral document. As you were saying, strategic priorities, walk the talk, mean what you say by putting money behind it, put a time behind it, putting resources behind it. So that's the project we're involved in. It's been really interesting. Hope to present about it at the upcoming conference in June, what some of our results have been, and sort of building community around this idea that emotional intelligence is critical for both learning and leadership.
That's awesome, Beatrice.
We'll see how it goes. It's going well. It's going good. So we had, come on.
It sounds amazing. So I wanted to pause for a minute. Just remind that people in the comment section, if you have any questions, you have these knowledgeable panelists here. It's your opportunity to engage them. And I also want to share that, including thinking about research, as part of this conference, EQ and CNU, we are doing a survey, and we're asking educators, students alike to complete the survey. So if you haven't got it yet, you can go to 6 Seconds website, sign up, register for the conference, and we'll be making the results of that research available right before the conference, and definitely after we look at the results. So just want to remind people, if you haven't done that yet, please feel free to do so. So I kind of wanted to, as we think about wrapping up here soon, I wanted to ask you all like a future question and get your brains engaged in, like, what would equity in higher education look like if it were achieved? So, like, what would this be? Tell me, give me your wish for what a campus would look like if we truly embrace equity, from the board down to the person who is doing maintenance and cleanup for us, that would often the unsung heroes and sheroes.
Sheroes. This week I came across an author by the name of Brandon Fleming, who shared such a powerful story about his experience in school and the experience of his professor. He's the author of a book called Miseducated. So Brandon hailed from inner city, and ended up at Harvard and felt like he was carrying the imposter syndrome, and was fortunate enough to come in contact with one of his professors who saw him for what he was, but did not call him out, but took the time and invested, took the EQ approach, invested in his learning, and that's where he is today. So for me, that is what equity in EQ looks like. That we can embrace persons from all walks of life and make them into who they are meant to be. We allow people to bring their best selves to the work. In higher education, particularly, to me, it's about access to scholarships. It's about having excellent tutoring, and it's about increasing those graduation rates. My passion is about raising the success rates and decreasing the level of ABDs that we have. So that's where my work is. So helping people to complete their dissertations and not doing all the coursework and then not being able to walk and to be hooded. That's what it looks like for me. It means for me that we have students who meet people where they're at and embrace them and bring their best selves, understand me as I show up as a student, and not like in my case, when I came to New York to study, I got marked down on all of my papers because I did not have that knowledge of the struggles of the black and white history. I didn't have the knowledge of the New York social policy, public policy perspectives. And as I imparted my own experiences into my papers, didn't have the 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 um a professor who could not see my perspective. So for me, equity in higher education is having that removed, where all persons are, and I would come back to the word, culturally sensitive enough to understand who is who is the student and what it is that the student is bringing to the table.
Thank you.
Well, I think it makes me think of Annie Dillard, who wrote, How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. And so if the ultimate point, as Olivet was saying, was being hooded, you're graduating, you're marching out the door. So that's the lifetime, right? In this metaphor of education, that's the end game of that arc. What has that student experienced every day so that they could end up at that finish line? Now, maybe some people come into it for whatever reasons much more well equipped, and they have developed the EQ that they're able to sustain themselves when they confront these obstacles that a lack of equity bring. And so I think what it would look, a student wouldn't have those obstacles, no matter what those obstacles are. It could be that a faculty in tech maybe doesn't allow enough time to see hands go up from women too, right? And there's a man of hand, I'm gonna quit. Or maybe we present materials even online, so much teaching is online, where students without readers who have difficulty seeing might not be able to grasp the content. So every day that would not happen. Every day they could access their materials. Every day they'd be given the same chance as someone else to answer a question. Every day they know that they're just as capable and encouraged to run for student government. And I think that's true on the employee side. With the employees, every day at a meeting, know that they can speak up and express an opinion. Know that working on EQ or working on equity is valued and we're behind it. So, and nothing is perfect, right? That's the overall ideal, but that pretty much consistently, that's the environment I'm in, that I am not running an obstacle course every day, that I'm not jumping a hurdle every day just to get my work done or just to go to school and get my degree. So that ultimately then, yeah, I'm at that finish line getting my degree. And it's so all encompassing because there are so many differences and so many things that perhaps get in the way of being successful. Some of it is in our head. Some of it is, when I go home, I don't have internet, so what kind of assignments am I giving to students that can they keep up? How am I investigating that part so that students all have a chance to do well? And it's a lot. That's a lot to think about, but that's why you do have to do it with others. And that's why, perhaps I'm harping on it a lot, but that when you do, I really believe in both equity and EQ work, all the burners have to be on. I think if you just look at one piece, it doesn't work. You got to turn on that whole stove and have things going. So if this is not percolating right now, we got somebody else with something happening and we got a positive story to tell. And I say that because I think it's true of EQ, but I think it's even more true of equity work, justice work. It's tiring and it's hard to do it. And you get a lot of rejection and pushback that happens. And so it's important to try to sustain people. There have to be glimmers of hope. And I think that's why it has to be, on all cylinders, cooking on the full stovetop, so that opportunities for success happen and other people see it. I think you also have to celebrate when good things happen, because it is difficult work, because it never ends. You have to take opportunities to sustain each other and celebrate and come together and acknowledge the good hard work you're doing.
Thank you very much. Speaking of hard work, Kay Ali has a question in the comment section. And the question is, how do you convince DEI leaders and educators who view EQ assessments as a Eurocentric tool built on norms that have gaps in DEI and is loaded with bias as they see it? I will give the panelists a break for a second, and I will attempt to offer some thoughts on this if it's an area of great interest to me. And so one of the things I would say is that we have to be able to look at EQ origin stories beyond Goldman and those in Harvard and who quote unquote originated the concept of EQ. And I share that with you because I think these two women would attest, as born in different countries, immigrants to the United States, they have cultural wisdom they learned from in their own life that probably talked about their self-awareness, probably addressed their relationship management, probably looked at in terms of how you build relationship with each others and how you manage yourself, which are core components of EQ. And so I think we have to make room for alternative origin stories to where EQ is created. And we can then tell those stories from those perspectives, and we can have a richer understanding of EQ. And for anybody who is a fan of Dave Chappelle or not a fan, he has a skit that he does multiple times in his show, and they call it "When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong." And it was one of the greatest examples of, if you're not in using your emotions strategically, you can be used by them, and you can get yourself in a world of trouble. So I think the room is convincing is that if we change our mindsets about where EQ comes from, we can see the deeper connections with DEI. I don't know if panelists have anything else they would like to comment on.
So I think, Isaac, what I would add to that is at 6 Seconds. 6 Seconds has done some excellent work in bringing EQ down to the average person's level. A simple term is being smarter with your feelings and getting persons to buy into, what does it mean when I show up? Do I know who I am when I show up in a space? And what choices are I making, and how intentional I am about my choices? And then the work that I do, how do I give myself to bring about that greater good? And I think if we approach EQ more from a personal way of life, a way to be, and a way to live, then it is not as abstract as persons make it out to be. EQ is lived. It is how we show up every day. It's about the choices we make, not only and everything that we do. So I like the 6 seconds model, if only for its simplicity and making it real, like you said, like going back to Dave, it's reality. It's about those daily choices. And when we look at it like that, then the notion of having to convince people, to me, it goes away because it's not abstract. It hones in on our daily activities, our daily living. That's what I would add to that.
Thank you, Oliver.
I'd add that kind of some of the ideas from before about meeting people where they're at. And so I think sometimes people, they just don't realize that everything is based on these Western ideas and everything just flows from that. The majority of what we talk about ends up flowing from that. And so I do believe, again, high expectations. If I share this with you, you're gonna learn, you're gonna ingest some of it. I trust that you will accept some of this. Maybe not all of it, maybe not today, maybe it'll take a week or a year, but I have high expectations for you that you're gonna listen with an open mind. And so listen to this for a second. Here's what I got. And so I do think it's important to try to bring people other information, not just what I'm saying, that reinforces this point. So for example, in diversity work, working with either students or faculty, often I would bring examples of infusing diversity, equity into science, very specifically, because people will say, oh, in social science you can do it, in English you can do it, that's easy. Oh, you just bring in this author or this kind of thing. But no, you could do it in math and science. So for example, in science, one of the things I would do is bring in a story from an anthropologist who shared a difficulty he was having with a student who just wasn't getting the animal classification system. This is a college professor. And the student was Inuit from Alaska, so a native person of Alaska. And the reason he didn't get it, the Western classification system that the professor was trying to teach, is because the native peoples had a totally different classification system than what we use. And it worked just fine. But it was not based on this Western classification that we use, kingdom, phylum, all of that. And it was based more on the life of the animal and humans' interaction and relationship with the animal. And it might change whether the animal was living or dead. But that is science. And so I think bringing in opportunities that just open a window, like, I never thought about it that way. Doesn't mean they're necessarily jumping into your camp, but if you can get to, I never thought about it that way, you just kind of open the whole door. So, that's kind of true in another situation I was in with dancers, and the dancers don't want to do the rigor. No, they're trying to communicate to you that their bodies are different and just as beautiful as maybe how we picture Western ballerinas, right? And so how do we acknowledge that they have just as much rigor and practice in what they're doing, but their bodies are formed differently? So I think providing information, having high expectations for people that they'll give it a chance, because if you're going in with it that, they're never going to get this, if you don't have some faith and trust, then maybe they won't. So we have to kind of enter into that relationship with some empathy and compassion and high expectations that people will come along part of the way and join us.
Thank you both for your responses. We're going to wrap up our time today. I want to remind people in the chat, there's a link to the survey. If they want to take it and participate, we highly encourage you to do so. Also want to share with you that we have another live stream that will be taking place on June 8th, 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 Eastern, where we're going to be examining and exploring desiloing EQ for CNU, a framework for systematic social emotional learning in colleges and universities. And that's coming up on June 9th. And that's going to be another opportunity to engage in this discussion before our conference at the end of the month. So before we leave, I would just invite the panelists to share any parting words with our audience before we sign off for our time today.
I think there is hope. there is hope for EQ in the DEI work and in education. A lot of the DEI work started with protests and struggles and have been concentrated in, the legal sphere, but more recently is now being brought into more mainstream society, and even more recent, bringing EQ as a way of life or a practice for higher education. I think I mentioned to someone recently that it is the long beginning. We're at the beginning, but there is hope. I am hopeful that if we can get it right and we continue to press on doing the things that we're doing, then one day we will no longer have to have these types of conversations, that it will be normalized. We can normalize EQ, and there we wouldn't even have to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we would all be at the same place. That's my hope. That is my dream. And I really hope that, with some of this work, that we can achieve that goal. Things like the uprising, or the protest they had at UNC at Chapel Hill last year in relation to um, Nicole Hannah Jones protests, when I started out my journey in my master to do my master's, of students protesting to get equal rights. Those things will no longer become the norm, but we can just all be have access to what is rightfully ours and live in a society that was built for all. That's my hope. That's my dream.
Thank you very much.
I would add, Isaac, you mentioned John Lewis earlier, and from something I was doing recently, I just happen to have right here, because it really spoke to me, a different quote, not about good trouble, but related to good trouble. And he said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime." And how I take that is, there's going to be ups and downs. You can't look at one day and say I lost or I won. Just like us, just like human beings, that, yay, I learned everything I had to learn, I'm an EQ person. No, it's a constant thing. Every day you wake up and you try. And that means every day there might be a disappointment, but that was that day. We're going to try again tomorrow. Like the things that are important in life, like love, you work on it every day. So I would say that, because sometimes with the EQ work, equity work, it is hard. And these days have been tough, what we're all coming out of. So to know that it's the long game. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And we're gonna keep at it. We're gonna train. We're gonna train all the time so we can finish strong.
Well, I thank you all very much for your wisdom and insights. You see some thank yous in the comment section that are being posted for you all. And so we're going to leave the space today. We're looking forward to seeing you later on in June. And I would like to say that I think what the panelists have shared with us is inspirational. I hope that we really, as a community of people concerned about higher education, take on the challenge to change it. It was created in an old model that wasn't made for today's students per se. And I think emotional intelligence is going to be key for us to refashion higher education to a place that welcomes all. So with that said, thank you very much to all the people who asked questions and participating. Please share this in live stream to others who didn't get the opportunity to get this wisdom today. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Isaac.
you, Isaac. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you.